All right, so fire up your terminal, cd to your work project space directory, and install the Turbo CLI. Put in your password, put in the right password, and then run the install. The CLI does a lot of things, but the one we're going to use today is the React Redux scaffolding engine. So it's going to scaffold the React Redux project for you with the entire environment just ready to go. So a good question earlier was, why don't we just use Create React App, which is a great tool, but it doesn't give you the Redux environment already configured. Okay, so that's why we're using this. Also, I built it, so that's why we're using it too. So. And just to give you a quick rundown of what we're going to make an app where you can search for local restaurants, coffee shops, shoe stores, whatever, using the Foursquare API. We're going to render a list of venues, and then want to click on one to look at the website, and that's it. Very, very simple for an app of this level of complexity or lack of complexity. Redux would be overkill, but the idea is to show you Redux in a simple situation, so you can wrap your head around the Redux idea. Architecture. Okay, so is everyone ready to go? All right, so let's go with Turbo new and then venues. Venue search, just like that. Okay, and that's how you scaffold an app using Turbo. And here it is right here. Right off the bat, you have a fully functional React Redux application. That's why we're using Turbo. If you look at the SRC directory, you'll see the entire React Redux ecosystem all set up. It's all scaffolded. Okay, there's a lot going on here right off the bat, but rather than go through and explain everything from the bottom up, I'm just going to show you how the architecture comes together, and then we're going to start building around it. Okay? Yeah.
Venue what?
Venue-search.
Search.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yep, come on in, grab a
I'm
seat.
so sorry.
No problem.
Didn't know it was here.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Sorry.
Fine.
Okay, so if you open this up in your text editor, Sublime, or whatever you like to use, like I said, there's a lot of stuff already put together for you. That's what a scaffolding engine does. Create React App does something similar. It just doesn't give you as much. I'm adding more on here, which most notably is the Redux Architecture. Okay. If you open up the SRC directory, you'll see a lot of stuff, but don't be intimidated. It's all stuff that you see in almost every full-stack React Redux application. So the sooner you get used to it, the more comfortable you get with this sort of structure, the better off you're going to be. So right now, let's just point at the basics. We have our index.html, which is our entry point, our index, our home page, quote unquote. Okay. If you open that up, you'll see that we have a series of imports, just a couple of JavaScript files, and these are the React Redux imports. Okay. And this stuff right here, these two imports, lines 13 and 14, that's compiled code. So that code must be built to be generated into that. Okay, we're going to do that through Webpack. Okay, this code hasn't been compiled yet, so none of this will work. Okay. If you click on the SRC directory, which is already open, you'll notice that there's also an index.js file. Right. This is the React entry point. Okay. This is where your React code begins. This code will be compiled into the bundle that gets imported right here. All right. And as far as Redux is concerned, the provider component is what makes it a Redux application. Okay? The provider is essentially the connection between your React app and the Redux flow. Okay, so that's what makes it a Redux application. All right, if this was a pure React app, you would only see this intro. All right, don't make that change. I'm just illustrating the difference. Okay, so we want to leave Redux in there, obviously. So that's the current structure. What you want to do right now is cd into the project. Okay, so cd into the project, and we have to install the dependencies, so npm install. And this usually takes about a minute when we're installing a lot of packages. So when you do create React app, this kicks off right away. So it's basically the same idea. Okay, so while this is going, it takes about a minute. Another file worth pointing out is the webpack.config Jas. For our purposes, you will not need to change this too much. In fact, you won't need to change it at all. But I do want you to see what's going on here. Remember I said earlier, the files need to be built into a bundle. Right? The source code gets compiled and built into a minified bundle. That process happens through Webpack. Webpack is what executes that process for us. There's a lot going on here, but the only lines that you need to worry about for now are lines 10 and lines 15. Okay, line 10 is the one that specifies where your React code begins, the entry point. Okay, that's why it's called entry. And Webpack will go in there. It'll compile all that code and all of its dependencies, combine all the assets and whatnot, and then do what's called bundling. Webpack is a bundler. And then it'll put the output right here. Okay? And that's the important thing for now. Okay? So when we run Webpack, that's what's happening. And if you pay close attention, src index, that's this file right here, the entry point. Okay? That's the connection between everything going on. So when you run the npm install, which should be almost done, one of the last things it does is it runs Webpack. Okay? The Webpack build output is this right here, all the way up here. This is the Webpack output. All right? So that's a successful Webpack build. So if you open up your code base, you probably didn't notice, but there are more directories here now. The most important one is dist. Okay? That is the compiled code for our React. All right? This was generated just now when we ran the build. Got it? So if we go into our actual folder and grab the index.html and now open it up, this is the React Redux project that's scaffolded for you right out of the box. Okay, you are currently looking at the index.js of the src directory. Got it? That's the scaffolding of Turbo. That's why, I use Turbo in all my apps now because this just saved me about 45 minutes of setting up and whatnot. So, and to teach, this is usually about 2 weeks of class. Right? So, Rob, you took one of my classes, right? How long did it take just to teach the infrastructure? A while. Right. So, what I'm trying to do is get to the concept sooner, because very often people get lost in the minutia of setting up all the files. It's important to be able to do that, but if you're missing the forest for the trees and you don't understand how everything comes together, what's the point? Okay? Literally, what's the point? Right? So that's one of the reasons I built Turbo. The Turbo is my platform. Another reason I built it is just to help myself scaffold projects a lot more quickly, just to get stuff out the door more efficiently. Okay, so how are we doing so far? All right, so this right here, what you're literally looking at is the intro component right here. All right, so I put an intro component just so you can kind of see how the pieces come together, kind of like a puzzle. All right, so if you look at the intro component right here, you see intro, you're looking literally at the source code of the front page. Okay. Now, we're not going to use any of this. We want to create our own app, obviously. So let's get rid of the intro component. Let's just get rid of it. And let's start developing our own source code. All right? So open up your terminal, cd to the src directory, and then let's create cd to the components directory. All right? We're going to create a new directory called layout. And then cd into that. And then we want to create an index.js. Basically, every directory should have an index.js, kind of like a table of contents. Okay? And then inside the layout directory, we are going to create a search layout, basically the search page. That's what we're going to create right now. Okay? So we're going to create the search.js. All right? And that's going to be our main interface, and for today, it's going to be our only interface. Okay? So, like I said before, this is sort of a contrived example. Like normally I would not use Redux in this situation because it's too simple for Redux. Redux would be overkill for this. But I want to show you how Redux works in a simple environment so that you can get, you can start baby steps. You can start simple and move up to higher levels of complexity. So now if you open up the layout index.js, let's import the search component, and then let's export it so that we can use it elsewhere. Okay, just a quick, sort of setup of the index.js. Nothing too complicated here. Okay, and then open up the search.js. Let's make sure you guys have this.
We can have another sort of React, another class like this. You have another meetup?
I do meetups twice a week.
Twice a week?
Yep.
So there'll be another one? Yeah, I have to leave.
Okay.
I'll probably see the next
All right.
one.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
All right, so in the search.js,
A quick question.
Yep.
Why index is small data is
one more time.
the index is small data, but search you started with a capital S.
Oh, that's mostly convention. Sometimes the index is lowercase. That's not really convention. That has to be lowercase. So in every JavaScript directory, the index.js is your root file, right? But the search component, I like uppercase for my component names, but some people like lowercase. I've seen it go both ways. So, okay, so here we're going to create our search component. So okay, very, very simple, HTML. It's not really HTML, it's what's called JSX, but you can think of it as HTML. It's not going to be that far off. So if you don't know how React works, you're basically defining HTML components, literally what's called components, which are just building blocks of HTML pieces that you can reuse in your UI, kind of like Lego pieces that come together to create your UI. Right? That's a very gross oversimplification, but that's how you can think of React coming together to create your UI. So here we're creating a very, very, very simple building block, which will eventually become our overall search UI. Okay? So I always begin this way just to make sure that the connections are successful. All right, now once we have our search component defined, we want to import it into the entry point so that we can render it, right? So before I do that, is everyone caught up? Okay, so in the entry point, in the index of the SRC, we now want to import the search component that we just wrote, right, from the layout directory. We now imported our component, the one that we just wrote, from the layout directory. Okay, just a regular import, right? And then we want to render it right here. Right? So that used to be the intro component. We took it out, and now we have our own search component. Basically, we are now developing our app inside the confines of React Redux. Okay. Again, this is one of the big reasons we're using Turbo, because everything up to now, if we didn't use Turbo, would have been about 3 hours. So we want to get that out of the way. That being said, it's important to understand, but we will get through all the concepts as we build our application.
Can I see searches for a minute?
Okay, so right now that's all we need. So we want to go back to our terminal. Make sure you cd to the root level directory, okay, the name of your project. All right. And then open a new tab by doing Command T. And we want to have 2 tabs running. Okay, we are now going to rerun Webpack. Now keep in mind, again, React only runs your compiled code, right? We did not compile the code yet. So we have to recompile, which we just did, and now our changes will show up, assuming we made no mistakes, okay? So if we reload the site, now we see the component that we just wrote. Okay, we swapped out what was there, and we put in our own stuff. Okay, I moved a little bit fast on that, but on the Webpack, make sure you have that W flag. That stands for watch. Okay, so what that means is anytime you make a change, Webpack will automatically recompile the code so you don't have to remember over and over again. That's why I said open a new tab.
So what is the Webpack? It's like
it runs the build scripts. It compiles all the code. Okay. So remember what I said earlier about how the Webpack config? There's a bunch of lines in the Webpack config that's already set up for you, right? Like I set that up. So in other words, those build scripts are already prepared, so you can start building your app right away. Okay, this is actually one of the things that Create React App doesn't do for you. They obscure the Webpack, which I don't like. Webpack is extremely important. Right? Every professional assignment I do, I have to go into Webpack and make changes. So if you don't know what you're doing over there, that could be a problem. Yeah.
I need to install Webpack first.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Sudo npm I Webpack, just like that. So I got to add that to my list of stuff you need. Okay, and now we've successfully confirmed that our UI has taken over, and now we can start building with confidence that whatever we make is what's going to show up. Okay, so what we want to do next is set up a very simple search UI with only two inputs. We want a location input as well as a search filter, like what are you searching for, like shoes, pizza, coffee, ice cream, whatever. Right? We only want two filters, location and search. I'm sorry, filter, or what they call query. Okay, so going back to our search component, where this is where all the work is going to happen. So we want to set up what's called the state. Okay, so you do that inside what's called the constructor, which I'm not going to get totally into right now, but right here what we're doing is setting up an object which will track the search that the user is currently executing. Okay, so the user is going to, in this app, the user is going to search for stuff based on location, venues, right? So the location is going to be stored right there, and the query is going to be stored right there in that object. Okay, and the query is what you're looking for. So again, that's food, shoes, whatever you're looking for. Okay, gyms, whatever. Okay, this is how you track state in a React component. All right, everyone with me? So now let's set up the UI where the user can type in, what he's looking for. So here we're going to add a class, an HTML class called container. I'm going to add another div. So I am using Bootstrap because automatically in Turbo comes Bootstrap. It's another nice, convenient thing you don't have to think about all the time. Eric, I'm sure they taught Bootstrap at NYCDA.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going with very conventional tools here. So I want to make sure that people don't have to relearn everything from scratch. Okay. So here I set up a two-sided UI, a left side and a right side, where the left side is more narrow and the right side is wider. So kind of like the Sublime UI. You see how the left side panel is narrow and the main area is wider. Okay. This is very, very standard Bootstrap, just regular Bootstrap stuff. So here we're going to add a header. Call it search venues, and then we're going to add a couple input fields. text placeholder location. Make it a little bit smaller. Query and then location. Search. That's it. So again, none of this should be totally new to you. It's just regular HTML. Again, it's actually technically it's JSX, but we're really just programming HTML, so this shouldn't be completely new to you. Here we set up just 2 input fields, a couple placeholders, and a button. That's it. All right. So remember, I have Webpack watching the files, right? So I don't have to rerun Webpack anymore. It should have recompiled already. So by the time I reload the page, this stuff should just show up. Okay? Because Webpack is still watching. Okay, I moved a little fast on that, so just take a look at this and make sure you have that, you know, as I see it. And then confirm on the browser that you see the same thing. And while you're doing that, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to connect functions to these inputs such that whenever the user types letters into the input fields, the state of the component will update with the new values. Okay, and that's fundamentally how React works. When you update the state, when the user does something, that should update the state of the component. Okay, so we have to connect that. We have to make that happen. Okay, so what that means is we have to create a function for the inputs and then bind the inputs to those functions, kind of like attaching handlers to regular DOM objects. It's kind of the same idea, but it's the actual execution is different. So here we're going to create a function. Are you guys good to go? Okay. So let's say update search filters, right? And this is regular HTML, so, well, it's not regular HTML, but it does eventually go to HTML, so there is an event input in there. And then we are going to bind each input to that function. All right, just like that. So now what do? We created a function right there on line 15, and then we binded the input to that function. That's how it works. It's that simple. And the function obviously doesn't do anything, but this is how that process takes place. Okay, so we actually want to bind both inputs to that function.
Do you have to write anything in the index functions? Just entries?
Well, this is the main index.
No, in layout.
Just this is it. That's pretty much all we're going to do with that.
Oh, okay. Maybe
Okay. So what that means is every time I type a letter into the input field, or every time I type anything in there, this function will trigger every single time. Okay, and we can confirm that pretty easily just by running a console log. One good thing about React, one of the many good things about React, is that when you're dealing with the JavaScript, underlying JavaScript, it's plain old JavaScript. There's no like weird library you got to inherit. It's not like Angular where you have all these special functions and like monikers. And did they teach Angular at MSCDA?
No.
Right, they have all the Angular has all these special like weird like nuances and names and conventions you have to follow. And in React, that's not the case. It's just JavaScript. So here, I'm just doing regular old JavaScript that they did in 2002. Like it's the same. Right, so here, when I reload the app now, and I run the console, if you don't know how to open the console, it's Option Command I. Okay, you'll see that as I type, this is happening. Okay, make sure you see the same thing, otherwise this whole process breaks down. Okay, you see down here as I type, you get more and more letters showing up down here. Okay, so the connection was successful. All right. So this is my source code. Make sure yours is the same. Okay. So now, what we want to do is update the corresponding field from the input. So here, I can add per arguments to the function. It's just a regular function. You can add your own arguments, right? So I'm going to add an argument called query. and another one here called location. This way I can decipher which input is telling me what. Right? Otherwise I won't know which one it's coming from. Okay? So I added an argument, and that argument pops in first and then the event second. Just easy to forget that. I often forget that. Oftentimes I reverse the two. But if you pass in an argument, whatever you pass in goes first, and then the event goes second. All right? So now I can see literally which field is being updated. And then I can make the corresponding adjustments. All right, so let's confirm that that worked. So you see here it says query equals. Oh, give it a second. You see that? Now I can deduce which input is firing off those functions. And here's now it's location. You see that? So now I know where it's coming from. So that's a step closer to what we want. Okay, now we're ready to actually update the state. That's the main goal here, is to update the state. So here is the current state, empty properties on both attributes, right? That's obviously no longer the case. So what we want to do is grab the search object, update it with the corresponding field and whatever the value is from the target, right? And then we reset the state. I'm not going to get too much into the mechanics here, but this seems a little bit verbose for what we're trying to do, which is just update the state. Then the main thing that you need to understand here is that you never truly change the state. What you do is you make a copy, which is what we're doing right here on, what we're doing right here on line 17, we're making a copy. We mutate the copy and then we reset the state. So line 18 is where we mutate the copy, and then line 19, 20, 21 is where we reset the state. This is a fundamental principle of React that you just have to remember. Okay, there are ways you can enforce it by using things like immutable JS and things like that. But the important thing to remember is that you never really mutate state directly. You always make a copy and then you reset. Okay, I'm not going to get too much into that. That's not really why we're here, but just understand that. Okay, just for now, just remember that. All right. So we now have our state being updated whenever the user types in the input, right? So now we want to connect a function to the button saying, please search with these parameters. Got it? So let's create another one called search venues. And we'll just do search venues. So right now, all we're going to do here is we're going to just console log the current search state, and that's it. We just want to visually confirm that our state is properly up to date, and that's it. Okay, so now we have another function, so we have to bind it. So what do we bind this one to? The button, exactly. So on the button, we trigger the onClick, and then this search venues. And that's it. Okay, so now we can test it. So real quick, I'm going to test it. And there's the output we want. You see on the bottom, the JSON of the current search. So I'm going to leave this up here because, again, I moved a little bit fast on that. But I just want to confirm that I didn't make any mistakes. So now that's been confirmed. So make sure you have the same thing. Okay? So we did a lot just now. We set up the state. We updated the state as the user did inputs. We connected to a button that just gives me a console log. And now we've confirmed visually that the state is up to date as the user types. Okay? That's been confirmed. So now we're ready to actually run the search. Okay, we're ready to actually call an API and actually get some real data and start doing like actual stuff. Okay? How are we doing so far? Good? Okay. Thought you had a question, sorry. Okay, so now let's actually execute the query. Okay, we're going to use the Foursquare API because it's clean, it's easy, and that's why we're using it. Okay, so we need to set up a way to actually query the Foursquare API. So what I'm going to do is put a sample request on the meetup page, because that's probably the easiest way to get it. Okay, so everyone go to the meetup page for this particular meetup. Okay, now if you just click on that, you are running a Foursquare API request, right? So there it is. That's the payload of the Foursquare request. We're using my API keys. Feel free to use it. I don't really care because I don't think anyone's going to abuse it. But here, we're running a search for coffee, right here. You see that? Coffee in New York City. You guys see that? And this is going to be our search engine. This is going to be how we get some initial data. All right? So we need to set up a way to actually run this request in the React project. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to import a module library called superagent. All right, superagent is just an HTTP module that makes requests for us on our behalf. So superagent is going to make that request we just made. All right. Everyone did that? Okay, make sure you have that. Okay, so then go back to your search component, and now we have to import superagent. Good. Now when we hit the button right there, that's where we hit the button, right? That's where superagent steps in and makes the request that we just did in the browser, right? So let's go ahead and do that right now. So we need the URL first. And for now, let's hard code the URL with the sample I put on the meetup page. Okay, why are we doing that? Because we know for certain this is a valid request. We're looking at it, right? So this request has to work, which means if we don't get this to work, the mistake is on our end, not their end. Okay, so just copy that as your URL. Okay, that's going to be our first request to Foursquare. All right, it's a pretty long string, but it's mostly because of API keys and whatnot. Okay, so now we're going to run the superagent request cycle. It's query. Okay, so superagent, the way it works is you make a GET request, you pass in the URL, you pass in some query parameters if you need to, you set some headers, which you don't necessarily have to do, but I like to do, and then this is the callback function at the end. When the response returns, you pass in a callback function. So let's do that one at a time. We pass in the URL. Now we do have query params, right? So let's set up a params object. Okay. You see everything here after the question mark are query params, standard URL query structure. So we want to put those in the params object. Right, so here we have the first param is just called v, which stands for version. Right, another one for near, that's going to be our location filter, right? So that's going to be New York. And then query, that's going to be our query filter, right? That's going to be coffee for now. And then we need a client ID. Just copy that. And then the client secret. And then just copy that. Okay, so we want to remove that from the actual URL. Your final request structure should look like that. All right, that's the way it should be done. Okay. So then you pass in the params into the query. We set some headers. Again, technically you don't need to set these headers, but I just like to be thorough about it. This means we're going to get JSON on the return data. That's all it means. Good. And then the callback takes an error and a data argument. Error is populated if there's an error, and data is the payload. So here we want if error, just throw up some sort of error. And then for now, we're just going to do console log because that's probably the easiest. JSON. All right, so here we're just going to JSON output the response. Okay, a lot of things going on here that I just sort of knew offhand. The data is the payload, but within the super agent library, it returns the payload in a body object. That's the super agent library. Okay, I happen to know that Foursquare returns a response key, and if you did not know that, which is totally reasonable, just look at what they return. We see response. You see on top? That's where I'm getting the response key, right? And then within the response key, there's a venues key. You guys see that? That's where I'm getting the venues key, right? So that's from me just knowing the Foursquare API, right? Obviously, if you didn't know that, just test it. Just go on the browser, see what you get. You got to figure out how to parse that. That's called parsing. Okay, so that's where all this came from. Got it? So now we're ready to test the actual request. Right? Keep in mind, it's all hard-coded. So no matter what we type in the inputs, it doesn't matter. We're just making sure the request is valid. Okay? So let's go ahead and try that out. So I can type anything here, right? It doesn't matter. And then now I get the Foursquare data that I get down here. You guys see that? That means it was successful, it worked. So now we're ready to actually rock and roll. We can actually put in our own stuff and get the Foursquare data out here, and then get that showing up over here. Okay, and believe it or not, we're still not on Redux. This is just regular React right now. Okay, everyone with me? Okay, so let's now incorporate our input values into this search, right? So you probably already figured out how it's going to go. It's this.state.search. Right here for location, right? Our search location filter, and then this.state.search query. Now we're inputting our values into the search. Got it? So now let's try that. So if I reload the page, let's try something other than coffee in New York. Let's try pizza in Chicago. Right, this way we can be certain the results are consistent with our search, right? So Connie's Pizza, it's very hard to read, but Connie's Pizza 312, which is a Chicago area code. So that was successful. Good. So now we have real data, right? So now let's render that data on the page, because obviously users aren't going to look at the console. So let's get that data showing up on the actual output. Okay? So what we want to do right now is inside the state, we want to set up another object to track any search results. Okay, so we're going to set up an object called venues, which is going to be an empty array to start. But when we run a search, we're going to populate that array. Okay? Good? Which means we can just do that right now. We can just, down here, those are the search venues, right? So what do we do? Can anyone guess what happens here? That would be mutating state, right? That's normally what you would do. And then you reset the state, right? You don't, keep in mind, you don't have, that wouldn't be wrong, that's fine. But you can just do like that, because that is a new variable, right? So, but what you don't do is push into it, right? You got to create a new copy, or just take another variable and then reset the state. Okay? So, Linda, your instinct is correct, which is actually kind of harmful in React. So I made that mistake a lot, is I would change state first when I was first starting out in React. And it took me a while to get that out of my head. All right, so we want to get used to that. Okay, so now we have our venues tracked in the state. Great, which means we can now render that data on the component. So here, beneath the button, let's do a horizontal line, and then let's do another header tag and search. Let's just say venues. And let's have these show up in an ordered list. Okay, so in here we're going to loop through the array and just put everything inside that list. Okay, so here what you want to do is this.state.venues.map. That the map function just loops through all the objects and returns whatever you want. So and then here we're going to return li tags for each venue. Okay. Now this is a weird nuance of React, but whenever you're looping through, you need to add a key right here. I'm not going to get into why. It has something to do with the server-side rendering, but just remember you have to do that. Okay. So now what are we doing? We're going through all the venues, and we're rendering a list item for each individual venue with the name populating the actual content. Okay.
What is I?
Oh, the index. You don't technically you don't need that. Yeah, I'm just being thorough. So I'm just ignoring it. Okay. So what that means is when I run the search again, this time I'll do the same search. Chicago. Right. Now we're getting the results right here. Remember Connie's Pizza was the first one? There it is again. That's why I ran the same search. Okay. So far so good. And just to make sure, and maybe we'll do coffee in New York. Okay. Also, if we had pushed here, the original result set wouldn't have gone away. It just would have appended to the original result set. And so this is why you want to just reset. Another reason, I should say. All right. So how are we doing so far? Okay. So now we have our search successfully rendering results. Everything is going according to plan so far. But keep in mind, we're not using Redux yet. We have not used Redux at all yet. This is all 101 React. This is the beginner stage of React, right? So where does Redux even factor in here? When would you use Redux? Why would you use Redux? So everything we did right here can be done through Redux, right? But in a situation like this, where it's a very simple application, it would be overkill. You would use Redux when you have multiple components, at least more than one, that need to have that share the same data. Okay. So if we have another component that needs this list, now Redux is the right move. Because if you think about it, if we didn't use Redux at all, if we had no Flux implementation at all, we would have two components maintaining two different states for the same data, right? And that can be very confusing, right? We don't want that. So since I'm not going to set up a whole other component just for this, I'm going to use Redux in this component just to force it through. What we're going to do is the following. We're going to add, oops. I'm going to wrap this inside of parentheses. You don't really have to, but I just find this easier to read about. And I'm going to wrap the venue name inside of an anchor tag. Why? So it can be clickable. That's all. Okay. And then I'm going to bind an onClick function called select venue. Right. Now keep in mind that function doesn't exist. This will not work, so we have to define the function and then implement some basic implementation. All right, so we're not doing anything new yet. We're just sort of doing the same thing. So here we have select venue. And I'm going to pass in the venue into the argument, which I did not do over here. That's a mistake. So I should have done this. Pass in the venue as an argument. All right? And then as usual, we'll just do a console log. Okay, so again, just simple method stuff, nothing, so far no Redux yet, just a very simple, just, select venue, that's it. So when I run the search again, you see how the little icon, like the anchor indicator shows up? So, right, so now we're seeing the JSON down here of the venues I select, okay? What I forgot to do was prevent the actual anchor tag from firing off. Now it's done. So it doesn't like trigger to the anchor tag, all right? So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna track the selected venue through Redux, okay? Normally what we would do is put selected venue right here and populate that value every time I hit the button. And by now you can probably figure out how that would look, right? But instead, we're going to use Redux to track the selected venue, okay? So that's going to require some discussion of the Redux architecture. So right now, we've done all of our work inside of the components directory. That's where everything started. That's the only place where we stayed, right? There are 4 other directories we haven't even touched. That's Redux. So actions, constants, reducers, and stores, those 4 directories are inherent in the Redux architecture. Okay? Redux revolves around the store. All the data of your application, as it relates to Redux, belongs in the store. So the store is the most important file of a Redux architecture. Okay? It's your home base of data. Okay? That being said, it's a little bit misleading because the store is really a collection of sort of sub-stores called reducers. Okay, so the reducers are basically where the responsibility of your data is delegated to individual units. So what that means is you don't want one file controlling all the state. That's going to be a massive file. It's going to be very confusing. You want to divvy it up into what's called reducers, where each reducer handles a certain section of the state that you consider most appropriate. Okay? So right now our application has basically a venues resource. But let's say there's another one for profiles. Let's say we're making a social network, right? So we have 2 resources now, profile and venues. Well, that should be fundamentally in separate reducers. Okay, that's how you want to reason about that. So right now in our situation, we want a reducer for venues. Okay? So we go to the reducers directory. And we create a venue reducer. All right? And that's going to track our whatever we care about the venues. And then open up the index. And don't forget to export it because it's very easy to forget these things. Okay, so our venue reducer is like essentially registered, like it's ready to go. Okay, if you open up the venue reducer, it's obviously empty. We just created it. So what we're going to do is take the user reducer, which came with the scaffold, and copy and paste it in. Grab all that and just paste it in. We're going to remove about 95% of this. So get rid of that. We're only going to track the selected venue, right? That's all we're tracking in this reducer. And get rid of everything else. Right here is the most basic empty reducer you can possibly create. Okay? So you don't have to write all this. You can just copy and paste it from the user reducer and just strip out what we're not using. Okay? Another reason why the CLI is just easy to get started. Okay? So now what's happening here every time the data updates, it will be sent to this reducer, and the reducer will keep track of whatever you want it to keep track of. Okay? In this case, selected venue. Okay? And it's up to you to decide how that happens. But inside the reducer is where it happens. Okay? So in a Redux application, it's fair to say the reducers are probably the most important part of it. It's where all the data is managed. Okay? So if you listen to the sort of the terminology I use, when there's an action, when there's an action that relates to the data, it goes to the reducer, right? So all data is transported inside of a Redux architecture through actions, okay? And we define those actions as well, all right? Actions have names, kind of like function names. We define those names as well. Okay, so we're going to do that next. So inside the constants is where we define action names, in addition to a bunch of other things, but among those are action names. So here, we're going to create an action name called select venue. And all this other stuff, just ignore it, because that's all scaffolded. Like it just came out of the box for your own reference. Okay, so our application only has one action, selecting a venue. That's what we're calling it right there. Okay, so now we have to go to the actions directory to define this action. You guys with me? So if you open up the action, yep.
Question: before you deleted the boilerplate code that the framework created, could you see it? In other words, does it manifest somewhere if you were selected somehow? In other words, is the default code, does it show up on the screen at some point? If you
No, it's not implemented. It's just for illustration.
Okay.
I put it there just so you can see kind of what's supposed to happen here. Right, so most of the boilerplate code you don't really want to use. I mean, you can. It will work. It's functional, but it's not really specific to any application. This is just an example. Okay. So now you want to go to the actions file. So this is the same thing. A bunch of default actions that just come out of the box, so you can kind of see how everything puts together. We're not going to use any of these. Okay, we want to create our own action. Select venue. Right? It's going to take a venue argument, because otherwise what venue are you selecting? And then here, the important thing to note here is that every action, this is called an action creator, every action creator has to return a JSON object like that with whatever keys you want, but the only one that's mandatory is type. Right? That key is mandatory, and that's the name of the action. All right, so type in this situation is really the same as name. Okay, so our action name is select venue. Okay, that's the action that's the name we decided for the sequence. Okay, so now remember where we are in this process. The action delivers data to the reducer. That's what's happening. It's very important to understand. Okay, so this data right here will go to the reducer, the venue reducer. So if we go back to the venue reducer, right, inside the switch statement, we want to set up a switch case for that action. And then we want to reassign the selected venue to the data coming from the action creator. Okay? So you see where it says selected venue on line 13? On line 4, it's originally null. But when the user selects a venue, this is going to happen. Okay? And then it'll populate the value with the data, the venue that the user selected. And just to be really safe with this, you want to do a console log here, because it's very easy to mess this up. In fact, it's almost likely that I did. So you want to just console log here, just to make sure that this is actually happening. Okay? So now we have our reducer function ready to go. Okay, this is where a Redux application really takes over. All the action kind of happens here, no pun intended, but this is where all your work essentially happens. So when I'm writing like unit tests and integration tests, most of that stuff revolves around this. Because if this breaks down, your whole app is done. Right? So this is what I'm trying to say, is that the reducers are probably the most important files of a Redux application. They're kind of the workhorse. Right? They do all the work. And that's where you define all that stuff right here. All right? So now if we go to the store, remember what I said a few minutes ago, the store is a little bit misleading. It's actually a collection of reducers. Right? All reducers come together in the store and they become the store. So a store is kind of like is made up of a bunch of reducers. So here we have the user reducer, but we didn't import the venue reducer. Well, now we did. There's the venue reducer. And then down here, we want to make sure the venue reducer is included in the store. Okay, so right there we're saying throw this guy in there as well. Okay, it's called combine reducer. So the store really is a combination of reducers. Okay, that's how you want to think of it. So now our venue reducer is part of our Redux architecture. Okay, so we're good to go there. So what we want to do now is actually trigger the action when the user hits the venue. Literally invoke the action. So what we have to do next is we have to go to the search component. And we need a way of connecting this component to the action sequence, right? What's called the dispatch. Right? So we have to import the actions I believe it's 2, right? Search. Yeah, 2. Okay. And then we have to import a small function called connect from React Redux. That's a very convenient function which does exactly what it sounds like. It connects this component to the Redux architecture. Very convenient. So then down here on the bottom, we now have to set up 2 things. We have to set up we have to set up the state and the dispatch. So we have to set up okay, so here on lines 95 through 100, that function connects this component to the store. Okay, so you see where it says state on line 95? That's actually the store. I don't know why the convention is to call it state, but it's really the store. Okay, but here I'm sticking with convention. I always see state. Okay? Now we want to connect the component like that. This component is now connected to the store, literally through the connect function. Okay? This is called the connected component. What's often referred to as a smart component or maybe a container component. This is not qualified as one of those. Basically, any component that has a direct connection to the store is a container or a smart component, a component that does a little bit more than just render data. Okay? So now we got to connect the dispatch, the action connectors. Right, so we const dispatch to props. I always spell that wrong, dispatch. All right, so here, what we're doing is we're essentially writing a wrapper function around the actions. You see here we have actions select venue, the function we wrote maybe 5 minutes ago. We are now connecting that function to the component through the dispatch to props function. So we have to now add this like that. So we've connected our component to the store and the action creators. So this component is truly more responsible now. It has a lot of things going on, right? It has a connection to the data and the functions, the actions. Okay? So now, when we select a venue, what we really want to do is call the action creator. This props select venue. Right, all that just so we can do line 60. Okay? So line 60 will trigger that data, go to the action creator. The action creator will then send the data to the store. The store will trigger a re-render on the component, and then the component will do whatever you deem necessary with the new data. And right now that's nothing, but if this is successful, we can now use the store to dictate the rendered HTML. Okay? So here, whoop, I made a mistake. In the action creators, I forgot this comma. Okay, so when Webpack is giving you red like that, I think it's pretty evident that you made a mistake. All right, we're good to go. By the way, I made this mistake, 10 minutes ago or so, and I quickly deciphered where it was. By far, this is the hardest skill for beginners to get their head around, is where they found their mistakes, where to find their mistakes. Okay, I will get into it in more depth in an actual class, but let me explain. This was not luck. All right, I very clearly read the error message, right? I saw the line number of the file, and I saw what it was expecting right here. And I pieced together, oh, I must have forgotten that comma on line 14. Silly rabbit, go back and fix it. That's the process that happens here. Okay, what most beginners do is they don't even read that, and then they start looking over here, all over the place in the wrong file, and you lose days. Okay, forget hours, you lose days. Okay, Rod, am I wrong? This is what happens. Okay, so I need to be very clear that we go through this in great detail in my courses, because this is the number 1, 2, and 3 weakness of all beginners, and it's a matter of mental discipline, not intelligence or experience or anything like that. It's mental discipline. Okay, so again, to be very clear, I mean, I was thinking kind of on my own, but I wasn't thinking out loud. But that thought process did happen. I saw the file number, I saw the line number, I saw what I was expecting, and I quickly realized, oh, I forgot the comma. Something I often do. So that's why I knew that was a mistake. All right, so we will definitely get into that in an actual class in great detail. Okay, so once you see this, it's all good to go. You want to see a bunch of green, everything looks good. So now we want to test it. So if we do coffee in New York, here are our results. And when I click on this, it's hard to see, but you see that line number right there, venue reducer. Right? The sequence was successful. The data went from the component to the action creator to the reducer back to the store. All that just happened right here. And how do I know? Because look at where this is coming from. Venue reducer. You guys with me? So what that means is, over here now, I can display which venue is selected, right? So in the main area, the right side, right? Search. That's over here, right? We can now use the Redux store, the Redux architecture to dictate what shows up there rather than local state, okay? This state, this props. So you see line 100 where it says venue, state.venue. Line 100 dictates that the venue object from the state, the store, is now a property on the component. That's why it's called state to props. Okay, so now it has a property called venue. That's the venue reducer. That's just a reference to the reducer, almost literally. and then selected venue, and then name. And that should work. However, it will crash at first because initially there is no selected venue. So we got to run a slide ternary here. I don't think there's a such thing as a slide ternary, so I'm just going to run a ternary. Okay, so basically I'm saying only render that if a venue is currently selected, otherwise don't render anything. Okay, just a basic ternary. Good, we have to do that again because initially that value is null, all right? And so, coffee, New York. So here we have our data, and then Toby's coffee, Toby's estate coffee. That's a little bit small, let's make it H2. Pizza in Chicago, except spell it right. And then Connie's Pizza. Connie's Pizza plotted in that. Right, there we go. All right, so ice cream in New York. There we go. I don't know. That's just the first one. So all right. So okay, there it is. Okay. Actually, have you ever been there? It's really good. It's right by where I live. So the important thing here is that this data is being rendered from the Redux store. All that just so we can do this. That's kind of why Redux is overkill for this situation, obviously, right? But you want to get a sense of how it works in a simple environment before you can build out a more complex scenario. So would Redux be necessary here? No, absolutely not, because we only have one component. So there is no inter-component communication going on. There are no other components. But if we had two or more components that all need the same data, now you really want to use Redux. Okay, right off the bat. So one sort of like recurring theme I have with sort of junior devs who are trying to learn React Redux is they say like, well, look, I only have two components or maybe three. Let me just use regular state for now. And then if it gets even more complex, we'll hook in Redux. And I say, no, that's not an option. No, if there's two, we're going right to Redux. Because really what it is local state is a lot easier to set up than the entire Redux flow, especially when things get complicated, right? So the natural impulse, is to stick with what's easy. That's just human nature. That's natural. Right? So I've had this conversation maybe 10 times in the past year. Usually what happens is one of my friends is a senior dev, and he doesn't know any React or Redux. He's like a Ruby on Rails guy or something like that, Python Django. And he'll say, one of my junior devs wants to use regular state rather than Redux. Is it okay if we do that? And I say no. And then they do it anyway. Right? And that's normally what happens. Right? So my point is, as soon as you get past one component, it is time for Redux. Even if it's a very simple situation, because you want to build off that anyway. What's going to happen down the road, if you get any kind of traction whatsoever, is you're going to build on top of it anyway. You're only putting off the inevitable. You're going to need Redux anyway, right? So if you don't get started early, what's going to happen? What are you doing? You're building what's called technical debt. I'm sure you've all heard that term. So what happens when you have 3, 4, 5, 6 components, all with their own individual state? You're already 4 months in. You spent, however many hours and dollars and whatever, and now you got to rewrite the whole thing for Redux, right? Well, what's the inclination there? Screw it. Let's just leave it the way it is. Right? I don't know. Maybe we haven't all seen that, but I've seen that many times. Right? This is like just par for the course in my industry. A lot of what I do is rewriting front ends. For customers, and Rob, you're doing one of these right now, for clients who've done like Angular 1, and the entire project is no longer maintainable in Angular 1, and they have to rewrite it in Redux, or React Redux, or even within React, like they wrote the whole thing in Flux, which is fine, but Flux is actually fine just as it is, but it's so hard to find pure Flux developers because everyone does Redux, right? So from a business standpoint, it makes sense to to shift over if it's financially feasible, right? If it's a financially wise move, if it doesn't cost you like $15,000 or whatever, that's what you want to do. So here we're using Redux in like pretty much the simplest way possible, just so you can get it working, right? And then from there you want to try to imagine how this would work across multiple components, and then add more and more data type, multiple reducers, multiple action creators. The action creators get more and more complicated. What happens with asynchronous actions? There's a reason why I picked an action like this, because it's synchronous. In other words, as soon as a user selects a venue, the venue is selected. There's no lag time. That's a synchronous action, right? What happens if the user selects a venue and you've got to wait for an API call to return the data, and then the selection takes place? That's called an asynchronous action. And that opens up a whole world of headache for a lot of React Redux developers. This is the simplest implementation literally possible. That's the action creator, right? But look at these. These are a little bit more, I mean, I shouldn't have even included this in the boilerplate because it's too advanced. I'm doing asynchronous action creators here. So the underlying implementation here is really gnarly. However, asynchronous actions happens everywhere. What kind of application doesn't make API requests, right? It's a very beginner level application. It certainly won't happen in a professional context, right? So that's why it's good to get your head around this sooner, right? Let me see here. I was going to do more on this demo, but I think it's going a little bit long, so I'm gonna shut down the video now. But I'll post this on my website tonight.